There is a photograph, and if you have spent any time in Turkish entertainment circles, you have probably seen it. Two people laughing in a way that does not look performed. Not the kind of laugh you give at a premiere or a press junket. The real kind. The kind that slips out before you can manage it. And somewhere in Turkey, a media machine decided that photograph needed an explanation. The explanation they chose was not the truth. It was the story they wanted you to believe. What actually happened between Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu, and who these two people chose to spend their real lives with, is a story the Turkish entertainment press has spent years carefully managing. Not reporting. Managing. And that distinction is everything. So today, we are going to go somewhere the cameras are not supposed to follow. Let us start with what you think you know, because that is always where the interesting part begins. Barış Arduç is one of the most recognized faces in Turkish television. He rose to fame in a way that felt almost inevitable, the kind of talent that does not announce itself loudly but simply appears one day and refuses to leave. Born in 1989, he grew up in Istanbul, studied acting seriously, and landed roles that showcase something rare. He could be charming without being slick, vulnerable without being weak. By the time he starred in the romantic drama Kiralık and later in the international breakout Fatih Harbay, audiences across Turkey, the Balkans, the Middle East, and eventually streaming platforms worldwide had made their feelings about him very clear. Elçin Sangu is a different kind of star. She built her reputation slowly, carefully, with the kind of intentionality that distinguishes a career from a moment. She starred in Kiralık Mevsimi, a show that became a cultural phenomenon, and she brought to it a quality that is genuinely difficult to manufacture. She made you feel like she was telling you something true, even when the scene was completely fictional. The audience trusted her. And that trust, as it turns out, became the very thing that made what happened next so complicated. Because at a certain point, Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu were cast opposite each other. And the Turkish tabloid press, which operates with a speed and confidence that is sometimes breathtaking, immediately made a decision. These two people were in love. Off-screen. Definitely. Obviously. End of story. Except that was not the end of the story. Not even close. Here is something that does not get discussed enough when we talk about celebrity culture in Turkey. The relationship between the entertainment press and the networks is not always what it appears. Ratings and romantic storylines have a complicated friendship. When two of your lead actors are being written about as a real couple, the audience tunes in differently. They watch for evidence. They analyze glances. They replay scenes looking for the moment where the performance becomes something else. It is, from a purely cynical perspective, extraordinarily good for business. And so stories get encouraged. Photos get interpreted in particular ways. Sources who are described as close to the couple turn out to be, upon closer examination, rather difficult to identify. The ecosystem is not fabricating things from nothing, it is selecting which things to amplify, which questions to ask, and, critically, which questions to never ask at all. The question that was never asked, at least not loudly, not persistently, not in the mainstream Turkish entertainment coverage, was this: what were the actual personal lives of these two people, away from the set, away from the cameras, away from the story that had been decided for them? That is the question we are going to sit with for the next few minutes. And the answer is more interesting than anything the tabloids offered. Barış Arduç, during the years when the press was busiest writing his romantic story for him, was in a relationship that was both visible and, in a very specific way, protected. He and Güpse Özay, an actress, screenwriter, and director who is, by any serious measure, one of the most talented people working in Turkish entertainment, had been building something real. Güpse Özay is not a peripheral figure. She wrote and starred in Bizim Hikaye, a show that drew enormous audiences and genuine critical recognition. She is someone who thinks carefully about storytelling, about character, about what it means to put something honest on screen. And her relationship with Barış Arduç, which became public knowledge over time, was not a publicity arrangement or a tabloid romance. It was a real partnership between two people who apparently chose each other with some deliberateness. They married. They kept the details of the wedding private, which given the media environment around them was not a small decision, it was a statement. And what is telling, if you pay attention to how both of them have spoken publicly about their lives, is that neither of them seemed particularly interested in using their relationship as content. In an industry where personal life is often the most valuable currency you have, they spent it carefully. That privacy was, of course, occasionally interrupted. There were photographs. There were appearances together. There were moments where the public got a glimpse. But the sustained, breathless, are they or aren't they narrative that had been constructed during the Elçin Sangu period was noticeably absent. Perhaps because it was harder to sustain a fiction when the truth was standing right there, clearly and quietly real. Now here is where the story takes a turn that nobody in the Turkish press seemed particularly eager to examine. The coverage that had surrounded Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu as a supposed real couple did not evaporate when reality made it awkward. It evolved. It found new angles. It reframed. Because the audience investment in that story was substantial, and audience investment has its own momentum. People who had spent months or years believing a particular romantic narrative do not always respond well to information that contradicts it. And media outlets that have built traffic on a particular story do not always volunteer the information that the story was, in significant ways, a construction. So what happened to Elçin Sangu during all of this? What was actually going on in her life while she was being written about as half of a relationship she was not actually in? Elçin Sangu met Gökhan Alkan. He is not an entertainment industry figure, which is itself a detail worth pausing on. In an industry where relationships between performers are common and often heavily publicized, Elçin chose someone from outside that world. Someone who was not going to be a co-star, not going to be another character in someone else's narrative. And she did not make this relationship into a public spectacle. She allowed it to become known over time, on her own terms, at a pace she controlled. They married. And in the way that genuinely happy things sometimes happen quietly, that marriage settled into something that looked, from the outside, like two people who had actually figured it out. But here is the detail that is almost never discussed in the coverage: the timing. The timeline of Elçin Sangu's real relationship overlaps in significant ways with the period during which the tabloid version of her romantic life was at its most intense. While the press was constructing one story, she was living a completely different one. And those two timelines, placed next to each other, reveal something uncomfortable about how celebrity journalism actually works. There is a concept in media studies, and forgive a brief detour because it genuinely matters here, called manufactured consent. The idea, simplified, is that the information environment around us is not neutral. It is shaped by choices about what to include, what to exclude, what to emphasize, and what to quietly let disappear. In political journalism, this gets discussed constantly. In entertainment journalism, it almost never does, because entertainment is not supposed to be serious enough to warrant that conversation. But the lives of real people are being shaped by these choices. Reputations are built and maintained. Careers are affected. Relationships are evaluated by millions of people based on information that has been selected and framed by editors and outlets with their own interests. That is not a trivial thing. It is, in fact, quite serious. And the specific case of Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu is not an extreme example. It is not a story of malicious fabrication or deliberate destruction. It is something subtler and in some ways more instructive. It is a story of how a media environment can construct a romantic narrative out of proximity, chemistry on screen, and audience desire, and then sustain that narrative long after the facts have moved in a different direction, simply because the narrative is too profitable to abandon. The English-speaking world got a filtered version of all of this. Subtitled clips. Fan accounts that operated without the institutional memory of the Turkish press. International audiences who loved these actors genuinely, but were working from a translated and curated picture of their lives. And so the mythology traveled further than it should have, and it lasted longer than it deserved to. Let us talk about what actually happened when the real stories became visible. When Barış Arduç and Güpse Özay became clearly public as a couple, the reaction in Turkey was interesting. There was the predictable disappointment from audiences who had been emotionally invested in a different story. There were think pieces. There were social media debates. Some of the discourse was unkind, which is a familiar feature of any moment when celebrity mythology collides with celebrity reality. But there was also something else. There was a significant group of people who responded with what looked very much like relief. As though they had always suspected the tabloid version did not quite add up, and having that suspicion confirmed was, paradoxically, satisfying. People are often more perceptive than the media gives them credit for. The story had always had seams showing, and some portion of the audience had been quietly noticing those seams for years. Güpse Özay was received by that audience with genuine warmth. And this matters, it is not just a sentimental footnote. The warmth came partly because she brought her own substantial reputation, partly because the relationship itself seemed authentic in a way that was easy to perceive, and partly because audiences were ready to engage with something real after years of being offered something constructed. Elçin Sangu's marriage to Gökhan Alkan followed a similar pattern, though with its own texture. The privacy she maintained around the relationship meant that when it became public, there was less opportunity for the kind of prolonged media construction that had characterized the earlier period. She had, in a sense, protected the relationship by refusing to let it become content before she was ready. That is a kind of wisdom that is not easy to exercise when you are famous and living in an attentive media environment. There is a broader question lurking underneath all of this, and it is worth naming directly. Why does it matter that Turkish media was not straight with its audience about the personal lives of these two actors? One answer is the obvious one. It matters because it is not true, and truth has value on its own terms. If you are telling people a story about real human beings, and that story is significantly different from what is actually happening, that is a failure of the basic journalistic obligation to be honest. But there is a less obvious answer that is perhaps more important. The stories we tell about celebrity relationships are not really about the celebrities. They're about us. They're about what we want love to look like, what we find romantic, what kind of people we believe deserve happiness, and in what form. When a media environment constructs a particular romantic story and pushes it persistently, it is not just managing the reputation of two actors. It is, in a subtle way, shaping what its audience believes is possible, what they find aspirational, what they think love looks like in practice. If that shaping is done dishonestly, if it is driven by ratings and engagement rather than by any honest attempt to understand and represent real people, then it has a cost that goes beyond the individuals being misrepresented. It has a cost to the audience, who has been offered something false in place of something real. And Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu, as actual human beings with actual lives, paid a version of that cost too. They spent years having their real relationships either ignored or actively crowded out by a story that served other people's interests. That is not a small thing to carry. Both of them, in the years since their real lives became clearly visible, have shown a similar quality, a preference for discretion that does not feel defensive so much as principled. They give interviews. They speak honestly when they speak. But they do not perform their relationships for the press, and they do not volunteer their private lives as a kind of payment for public attention. That stance is more unusual than it sounds. In the contemporary entertainment landscape, particularly in Turkey where the tabloid culture has become even more accelerated in the streaming era, maintaining genuine privacy while remaining a public figure requires active effort. It requires knowing what to say and what to leave unsaid. It requires a kind of clarity about where your professional self ends and your private self begins. Barış Arduç has spoken in interviews about wanting to let his work speak more than his personal life. This is not a novel sentiment, but in the specific context of his career, given how aggressively his personal life was narrated by others during his early years of fame, it reads as something more than a talking point. It reads as a conclusion he arrived at through experience. Elçin Sangu has been similarly thoughtful. Her social media presence, which is substantial, is curated in a way that shares without overexposing. She lets you see enough to feel connected, but not enough to feel like you are looking at something that was not meant for you. That is a calibration that takes real skill to maintain. Now, the international dimension of this story is something that has not received much attention, and it deserves a moment. As Turkish television has expanded its global audience, through streaming platforms, through fan communities on YouTube and social media, through the genuine quality of its productions, the celebrity mythology around its stars has traveled outward. Audiences in Latin America, in Eastern Europe, in the Arab world, in South Asia, have discovered Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu. They have watched their performances. They have formed attachments. And they have often done so with access to only a partial picture of who these people actually are. Fan accounts and international commentary have sometimes perpetuated the same constructions that the Turkish press built, often without knowing that is what they were doing. They were working from clips, from dubbed dialogue, from translated interviews that lost context in translation. They were building their understanding of these people on a foundation that had some significant gaps. This is not a critique of international fans, who are mostly doing something entirely human and understandable. They find people compelling on screen and they want to know more about them. But it is an observation about how media ecosystems can export their distortions as easily as their genuine content. When a false narrative is baked into the foundational coverage of a celebrity, and that celebrity then becomes internationally famous, the false narrative goes international too. What you are watching right now is, among other things, a small attempt to interrupt that cycle, to offer a more honest account of what is known, what is speculative, and what was simply never true but got told anyway. Here is what we can say with confidence, separating confirmed from rumored, fact from fan theory. Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu worked together. They had visible chemistry. They were the subjects of extensive media speculation about their personal relationship. That speculation was not grounded in confirmed reporting, but in the reliable fuel of proximity, performance, and audience desire. Barış Arduç built and committed to a real relationship with Güpse Özay, a relationship that has been public and, from all available evidence, genuinely stable. They are married. That is not a rumor. Elçin Sangu built and committed to a real relationship with Gökhan Alkan, conducted largely outside the tabloid machinery, on her own terms and timeline. They are married. That is also not a rumor. The years during which the tabloid story about Arduç and Sangu was at its most active were years during which their actual romantic lives were developing in entirely different directions from what was being reported. The gap between the media narrative and the lived reality was, during that period, quite large. None of what was lost in that gap was an accident. It was the product of a media environment that prioritized a particular kind of story over accuracy, and of an entertainment industry that understood the commercial value of romantic ambiguity around its biggest stars. What you are left with, if you step back from all of it, is something that is both specific to these two people and also completely universal. Fame is a negotiation. You offer your work, your image, sometimes significant portions of your time and your selfhood. In return, you receive attention, opportunity, and a kind of influence. The negotiation is rarely made explicit. Nobody hands you a contract at the beginning of a career that says, here is what we will take from you in exchange for success. But the terms become clear over time. What Barış Arduç and Elçin Sangu both appear to have understood, and to have acted on, is that not everything has to be part of the negotiation. Some things can be kept back. Some things can be protected. The people you love, the relationships that actually sustain you, the private life that makes the public one survivable, those things do not have to be content. They are allowed to just be real. The Turkish media that refused to tell you this story made a choice. It chose a narrative that served ratings over one that served truth. And in doing so, it asked you to invest emotionally in something that was not actually there, while the real thing, quieter, less dramatic, infinitely more interesting for being genuine, went mostly unseen. You have seen it now. That matters. What do you think? Let us know in the comments.